So by way of introduction, obviously, Lissa, we're really glad that we could have you back and hear from you and your experiences. So in terms of professional career, you've actually spanned journalism, politics, government, and business. And so as co-owner of Washington's premier independent bookstore, Politics and Prose, Lissa's previously served as director of speech writing for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and senior advisor on that presidential campaign. Presidential speechwriter and chief speechwriter to the First Lady in the Clinton White House. And that's something we're going to really be quite excited to hear more about. Graduating from Harvard with a history degree and also having read PP at Wadham. So I think on the note of Wadham, it's been quite exciting to have all of the alumni back and well, sort of hearing their key memories and top stories. So obviously it's a shame you're not back in Wadham, but throwing it back to your time when you were here, what were some of your favorite memories?
Wow. Okay. Boy, you're asking me, an older person, to remember anything, which is a challenge at this point. I remember, well, I lived on Holywell Street with graduate students. So, I felt a little bit removed from college in that sense. I probably shouldn't tell this story, but I will. One of my most memorable, and it's not really a good memory, was my very first economics tutorial, which involved maybe 4 or 5 students. I think there was one other American and a couple of British undergraduates in it. And the Don, in that case, who I will not name, was sort of a veteran of Wadham College and a sort of renowned economics Don. And he went to the chalkboard in one of our early classes, and he drew a parabola on the board. And he said, "This is the most perfectly symmetrical mathematical figure, just like a perfect woman's body." And my jaw hit the desk. I could not believe, this was a long time ago, but even a long time ago, that was a fairly jarring statement. And I just was shocked that he would say something like that, but that I didn't really do anything about it. So that was one memory. I studied French politics mostly with David Goldie, who's actually at Lincoln College. And I learned a lot from him, and I was very grateful for that opportunity. And I just loved being in Oxford. It's really hard when you come from the States and, and something old is like 150 years old and something new in Oxford is 1,000 years old. You kind of get perspective pretty quickly on your historical irrelevance. And so, I think it was a real immersion in, there were so many things that were doing, we had no cell phones, we had no email, texting. So if you wanted to socialize, I'm sure you've heard this a million times. So if you wanted to socialize with somebody, you would go to the porter, you would leave a note, they would take it to the college of whoever it was being delivered to. Their porter would then deliver it. So, you knew you were talking about a 5 to 6 day proposition to set up, tea with somebody or a visit to a pub. And, it was a kind of a rude awakening, but in a good way. I think the slower pace, it gives you the opportunity to appreciate the surroundings more, to appreciate the history more, to not maybe take the urgency of your own existence quite so seriously. So I guess those would be a few of the memories.
Amazing, thank you for that. And I believe there's a question from Robert Hannigan. Well,
sorry, Robert. Sorry, not so much a question, but over to you, Robert.
Okay. No, sorry, you caught me there. Actually, I didn't want to gate crash this at all, actually, because this is very much organized by students. And thank you very much, Karishma and Emma, for organizing it with William and the team. So I was just going to say thank you and welcome and great to see you back. But I have got a question, actually, which kind of follows on from Emma's and Karishma's really opening. And that is, how you went into politics afterwards. Was Oxford one of the things that inspired you to do that, or was it just a later decision? How we all talk about what it was being radical and political. Was it political then, and did it have any influence on you?
Wow, I've never been asked that question. And also, before I go any further, and I should have said this to start off my answer to the last question, thank you, Karishma and Emma and William, for organizing this and inviting me. I'm really honored. I mean, I know it sounds corny, but I love Wadham and I love participating in any way. And I always say I learn a lot more from the students than they learn from me. So it's a very selfish endeavor when I get to do things like this, but I really appreciate all the time and effort you've put into organizing it and including me in the program. So thank you, thank you, thank you. You know, Robert, I don't think I've ever been asked that. That's interesting. It was a very political time in the US because it was the Nixon administration and Watergate and, you know, the kind of Vietnam War sort of coming to an end and the civil rights movement. And I don't think I thought of Oxford as a political hotbed in the way that I knew it. I think I thought of Oxford as a place to ground myself in, first of all, a different perspective that was non-American. I mean, albeit European, but still not American. And a place to study more, you know, to become better versed in things that I thought I might need to apply in my life. But at that point, I wasn't planning to go into politics. I was planning to go into journalism. I had already started a career in journalism. I'd been a journalist for a year at a very small newspaper in the Delta in Mississippi, because I was very interested in civil rights. And this paper had a kind of history of reporting on civil rights. And I was from a very political family, very activist political family in California, but I don't think I, at that time, was planning to get into politics. And journalism at the time, I think because of Watergate and Woodward and Bernstein and all of that, journalism had a great appeal for people who were sort of interested in activism and advocacy because you felt like you were holding the powers that be accountable. And for me, that felt like a political path in a way. I mean, it was political in its nature. Even though we had to be, you know, nonpartisan and quote objective and all that stuff, which is, by the way, what eventually drove me out of journalism. But I think for me, Oxford was much more about grounding, you know, getting a sort of intellectual foundation and a perspective that was different and just being not in the US and understanding how other people viewed the US. So I don't know if that's a sufficient answer, but that's sort of what I would say.
No, that's very interesting. Thank you. I do have another question, but I'll save it till later, and I'll hand back to Emma.
Sure, thank you so much for that. And after having now reminisced about your time at Wadham, we were wondering what is the biggest piece of advice you would have for current students?
You know, it's a really tough world out there for all of you in your generation. I mean, you face very serious existential threats like climate change and you know, widening income gap around the world, which is awful, you know, rise of authoritarianism. I mean, these are really big existential threats. And I don't envy you that our generation dumped all this on you, basically by not figuring it out. So I think, though, what I would advise is sort of to remember the foundational values that are important, which is to say, you have to have agency over your own opinions and your own voice. And that means you have to be willing to defend your opinions and your voice in the face of authoritarians and of people who are despicable, and stand up for what you believe in. And, you know, that's, to me, that's sort of a kind of authenticity that's really missing from public discourse. There's no accountability. People just trash each other. They demean each other. It's very easy to just lambaste somebody, and it's on Twitter, and then that, you know, people are ruined. And if you're picking career, you know, whatever career you pick, there are going to be so many pressures to take the shortcuts that are convenient and easy and might even be weirdly fun because you get to be out there doing this, but that's not going to accomplish anything in the long run. And I think most students at Wadham are very committed to, you know, to social justice, to righting the world's wrongs, but you don't right the world's wrongs by erasing, despicable ideas and people from the landscape. Unfortunately, it would be lovely if that actually were possible. But I get very frustrated when I see a kind of resistance to other ideas, as awful as they may be. And so I would just say, be authentic to your beliefs, but be open-minded, or at least at least be willing to defend your beliefs. Don't just assume everybody has to agree with you. And if they don't, they're wrong. And that kind of authenticity is really missing in the political discourse on both sides right now. So I don't know, that's a pretty lame answer, but, and I guess the other thing, more practical thing I would say, and I tell my own kids this who are older than you guys, is, don't let other people tell you what you should do with your life. Follow what you need to do, what animates you, what stirs your spirit, what moves you, what makes you feel passionate. And you don't have to follow, look, financially, sometimes you have to do things you don't want to do because you have, debts or whatever. I get that, or you have to pay the rent. And that's understandable. And obviously most people have to do that at some point, but to the extent that you can be true to what animates you in your life, that to me is the most important thing. And it may not be what people expect you to do.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that really ties in well as well with the Oxford system and the tutorial system, going back to the idea of being able to defend your arguments and your beliefs, because I think most people when they leave Oxford are quite good at that, or at least know how to. And so it's important that we know to remember to continue through with that. I think moving on, you've touched on this a little bit, but in terms of how you got started when you left, how was that? How did you find getting started? And also, in hindsight, is there anything that maybe you would change or anything you potentially regretted or would have done differently?
I don't think I would change anything professionally, and none of what I have done was according to a plan. None. I was pretty sure after Oxford and maybe doing a little bit of journalism, I would go to law school. That was sort of the tried and true track. And, there are a lot of possibilities getting out of law school for both advocacy or, lots of other things. But I kind of had gotten the journalism bug. I had not planned to be a journalist. I'm exhibit A of a career that was not a straight line. And there's a wonderful book by the anthropologist Mary Catherine Bateson called Composing a Life. And the sort of sub message of it is, you can take the straight line from A to Z in your life and get there quickly and efficiently. But if you take the windy road through the mountains, you're going to get a lot better views along the way. And that's kind of a metaphor that I like. I was willing, I guess, to take on things that I hadn't planned or expected that presented themselves, or to really think about getting off the prescribed track. So I was a journalist for about 15 years, and I learned a ton. I became a much better writer. I got to, I just learned so much about the world doing that. But I discovered, coming from an activist family, I didn't like the kind of constraints and the pretense of objectivity. I don't think people are objective. They are subjective. They bring all their own experiences and biases, and you need to guard against that. You don't want to be partisan as a reporter. But the idea that you're somehow totally objective and you just suppress everything you think, it was very uncomfortable for me. That was the first thing. The second thing was, I didn't really want to be the reporter standing outside the White House waiting for a group of governors to come out so that we could ask them, oh, how did your meeting go with the president? And they'd say, no comment, or, oh, it was great. We discussed education. I'm like, I want to be in the meeting. I don't want to be waiting outside in some stakeout where they say nothing, meaningful. So the combination of those things got me thinking, and I thought about going into government. But the problem I had was that there was a succession of Republican presidents, none of whom I would want to work for. And then finally, Bill Clinton got elected in 1992. And he is older than me, but I'm sort of the tail end of the baby boom generation. And if you were a Democrat in those days, which I was, you were thinking, this guy got elected. If he's really lucky, he'll have 2 terms and he'll be in office for 8 years. But it's possible he's only going to have 1 term and be in office for 4 years. If I want to do this, I better try to do it now. And then I sort of thought, well, what could I do? I'm a journalist. Journalists are adversarial to the people in government. This is an antagonistic dynamic. And that felt weird to me. I didn't want to suddenly be going up against the people, that I've been communicating with. So I thought, well, I'm a writer. I've been a journalist. And I thought maybe I could be a speechwriter. And I was clueless enough to apply for a speechwriting job in the White House, having never written a speech. And, fortunately, I was clueless enough. And I wrote this is actually instructive. Everyone who's applying for jobs, this is instructive. I wrote a 4-sentence letter. I found the name of the guy who was going to be Clinton's chief speechwriter. And this was right before Clinton was inaugurated in January of 1993. And I said, I've never written a speech. I don't have any political mentors. I haven't given a dime to the Clintons. I couldn't because I was a journalist, but I think you should hire me to write speeches. Okay, so the guy writes back and he goes, no, we're not hiring. Bill Clinton promised to cut the size of the federal government. We're not hiring. I'm like, okay. My husband and I were thinking of starting a family anyway, so fine. A month later, he calls me back. He says, actually, we're thinking of creating a new job. It's going to be halftime for the president and halftime for the first lady. First ladies never had speechwriters. First of all, they didn't give that many speeches. Secondly, when they did give a speech, the presidential speechwriters grudgingly wrote it for them, even though they hated doing it. But Hillary Clinton was different. She was going to be the first professional woman ever to be first lady. And she was not going to be an accessory. And she'd worked on policy her whole life. And she was going to take on this huge role overseeing the reform of our healthcare system. So they decided they needed somebody who would be designated for her, but could also write for the president. Anyway, long story short, they asked if I was interested. I said yes. They gave me a trial speech to write, so I wrote it. They gave me another trial speech to write. Then I found out I'm pregnant. So I called the guy up and I said, I think I better pull out. I'm pregnant. And I know, delivering a child and taking maternity leave may not coincide with the rollout of healthcare reform. And he said, no, stay in it. We want to see the whole pool of candidates. I'm getting bigger and bigger. The pool of candidates is getting smaller and smaller. And then I find out I'm having twins. So then I had to go back to him again and say, okay, well, now this really is going to end my speechwriting career before it ever started. But they ended up hiring me. And one of the reasons they hired me, and I like to tell this story, is because, and there were not pregnant women, there were barely women running around the White House, let alone pregnant women at that time. I mean, I know it wasn't that long ago, but it was eons, generations ago in terms of protocols in the most male-dominated political institution in America, the White House. And so, I was like kind of an exotic zoo animal or something. But I found out a few years later that there was a discussion about whether to hire me. And there were a lot of people against it because it was going to create more work for people on the staff. And when I was on maternity leave, and then I'd have to be even more on bed rest because of the twins, et cetera. And so she had overheard it and she just said, time out. We're going to hire the best person. I don't care if this person has 1 kid, 2 kids, or 10 kids. Hire them and make it work. And people always say, you're so grateful to Hillary. Yes, I am. I got the opportunity of a lifetime pregnant with twins because she was willing to say this person can work in the White House in a high level job. But anyway, the point is just that I went, that was sort of a trying to navigate, what was wrong with journalism for me? How could I be more of an advocate? And then I worked with her on and off on other things, and then in the State Department. And then my husband got this opportunity to acquire Politics and Prose, which is an independent bookstore. And I wasn't participating at all. Here's the truth. I was rolling my eyes at him like, oh, right, you're going to own a bookstore. Okay. Because he was a journalist. Anyway, it turned out it was going to take 2 people to do it. So I agreed to help with that. And that's been a totally different career. I mean, the common thread, I would say, in all my job choices has been, they're all about the intersection of words and ideas and sort of the public marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of public discourse. But there are a lot of ways to do that, it turns out, which I had no idea. When I was your age, I could not have predicted any of these jobs.
No, I think that definitely makes it more interesting. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that answer. And the next question we had that you briefly touched on, especially with this idea of authenticity, but I was wondering what are some of the most crucial skills and characteristics perhaps that you need to be successful in politics or government or anything in the political sphere?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would love to say honesty. Sadly, that doesn't seem to be the reigning theory in most political, venues. look, I think you have to be very in touch with the people you serve, and you have to remember that you are a public servant. And when you run for office or you are making policy, you're making policy that affects people's lives, and you are representing people whose lives are challenging. And it's very easy in the sort of, halls of Congress or, Parliament to have a kind of theoretical approach to all this, but real people are affected. And so much of politics has become bombast and ego and theatrics. It's a competition over who's the most theatrical, who can be the most outrageous, who can say the most demeaning thing, who can scare you into submission because they're going to troll you if you don't agree with them. That is not healthy. That's not healthy for a society, and it's certainly not healthy for a governing system or a political system. And so, to the extent that politicians and people in government who are making policy, who are sort of executing what the political classes are determining, it's sort of to suspend ego and to remember that you are a public servant. You are serving other people. You are not serving, you're not serving your own interests. If you look at Donald Trump, I cannot believe that so many people in America can't see right through him. He is a narcissistic, massively corrupt, pathologically lying. It's all of the races where he's endorsing candidates now, there's only one criterion. Do they say nice things about him? That is he is sort of the greatest atrocity of what happens when you lose sight of what your role is in politics and government. And sadly, there are all sorts of people competing to be him, and unfortunately, some of them are smarter than him, so they're really dangerous. But it's just, how did we get to this point? Even, there are a couple of, I don't know how closely you all are following American politics, but there are two Republicans who have consistently stood up to him, two members of Congress, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. The courage it takes to do that, given the just public trashing by the right wing that they get, and the threats and the demeaning, and they have consciences and how they hold on to their, and I don't agree, especially Liz Cheney. She's really conservative. I agree with her about almost nothing, but I got to tell you, I really admire her because she understands what's needed in a democracy, and she's willing to stand up for it. There was a case recently that gave me a lot of heart, where in the Michigan state government, some right-wing anti-LGBTQ person was introducing a really awful, hateful, homophobic bill, and used another legislator, this was a Republican, and she accused this Democratic woman legislator who was, on the other side of this piece of legislation, of being a groomer, grooming children for pedophiles. She said that in public. And God bless this woman who was being attacked. She got up there and she said, we've got to stop taking this. We're also afraid of being trolled. But you know what? And she said, I am a Christian, white, straight mother of two. And and she just went after this Republican in the most eloquent and effective way. And we have to do more of that. We're so intimidated. And all these Republicans are so intimidated by Trump. They don't want to say anything bad about him. Anyway, so, I think remembering who you serve and suspending your ego would be my best advice.
Thank you so much for that. Krishi, I think you have the next
Yeah,
question.
I think following on from that, we were wondering, what are the dynamics of working in administration in these high-level political campaigns? I know you've already touched on obviously the White House being quite male-dominated, and also the fact that it was quite a career change from one side on journalism to the other side. But was there anything that surprised you?
There's a lot that surprised me. Bill Clinton appointed more women to the judiciary, more women to the cabinet, more women to senior positions in the White House. Obviously, he had a wife who he considered his equal, and his partner who was taking on the most influential role a first lady had ever taken in history. And yet even his White House sometimes felt like, a fraternity house. with a bunch of guys with towels, snapping at each other. Because it was an institution that just had never had a lot of women, nor had the US government. And I'm sure the same is true and possibly even worse in the UK. And it was just, we just were bumping up against that all the time. So that was one thing I think I was a little surprised by, just the kind of disconnect between the policy positions and the very intentional elevation of women in official roles, but the culture not really kind of being caught up to that. Certainly felt that in campaigns, there's kind of a big discussion among some of Hillary's old crew. When she first ran for Senate in 2000, as she was leaving the White House, she had never run for office. And so she hired a lot of, campaign experts, political experts, strategists, pollsters, policy people, media people, communications people. And obviously they were very different from the sorts of people she had in the White House, who were really focused on her policies, especially related to women's rights and human rights and children and families. And the theory was that, those of us in the White House hadn't worked on these big campaigns, so we didn't really know how to help run a campaign, so she had to bring in these experts. And one of the things I'm really trying to think hard about as I write this book, and I can't give you a really complete, coherent answer, is the extent to which switching to, and maybe gender is irrelevant and maybe it isn't, but to a male-dominated campaign team of people who were, experts who bounced from campaign to campaign and whose jobs are basically transactional. They're there to do this and then they do that. And they didn't really know her. And they certainly didn't understand her experiences as a woman in the political and public sphere. Whereas her team in the White House, that was 90% female, and really got to know her and really understood her and the connection of her life and her vision for the country with the policies she cared about, and how determined she was to get policies that are always ignored in the halls of Congress and the White House: children, families, human rights, and so on. Whether that didn't signal a kind of change that, she was a great senator, but that kind of maybe infused her presidential campaigns a little bit, and she wasn't as true to herself in a way. I don't know if that makes sense. That was a very meandering answer, but I just wonder. I think you want to know these people need to be known for who they are, and not sort of molded and manipulated into something that some expert thinks is going to fit the psyche of the American people or the British people at this moment.
Brilliant, thank you.
Amazing, thank you so much for that. There's a point there I'd really like to pick up on, and it's an anecdote I remember, not just from Hillary's campaign, but also from other women who have campaigned to be president. And it's about how every decision is more important than it would be if you were running as a man. And even things that you wouldn't think of as a particularly significant thing, like the outfit that you're going to wear to a presidential debate, can make such a huge difference, because if you wear the wrong thing, you'll get ridiculed. If you accidentally wear the same thing as another woman, or a similar thing as another woman who's at the debate, then both of you will be ridiculed. And I remember, I think it was Elizabeth Warren actually talking about how she coordinated with another woman who was in the Democratic primaries to make sure that they were wearing different colors and different outfits, just to avoid these sorts of things.
You're raising, Emma, such an important point, and it is the universal experience of women in politics when Hillary was running and today. And it's awful. It's a double standard, it's like a double standard that is so unfair and infuriating. And with Hillary, it was her hair, her clothes, her this, her that. She got, one of her great contributions, by the way, to womanhood, as far as I'm concerned, is making the pantsuit acceptable for any occasion. Because if you're getting in and out of cars all day, you don't want stockings on that are going to, it's just, you're not uncomfortable. Pantsuit, that was it. And she got so maligned for that. You weren't even allowed to wear pants on the congressional, Senate, and House floors at that point. So she got that changed. But anyway, until you have a critical mass of women, this isn't going to change. You also have a media, and there are women in the media and there are women in politics who have kind of been co-opted into thinking the same things because it's the only way to succeed. So you know, I will never forget. I mean, this has happened to Hillary from day one. She's shrill. She's so angry. She's so loud. Why does she yell all the time? And it's like, really? And I remember somebody saying that to me after she had debated Bernie Sanders. Have you ever heard Bernie Sanders? You know, I'm going to get the president. You know, nobody ever complained about him being loud and shrill and angry and, you know, caustic. And he was about 1,000 times more of all those things than Hillary. Here's how bad it got. In 2008, when she was running, there was a commentator on MSNBC, which is a liberal channel, cable channel. And he said, when Hillary Clinton walks into the room, you need to cross your legs. He said, I never can watch TV if she's on while I'm shaving, meaning, you know, I might cut myself. Kentucky Fried Chicken, a franchise of Kentucky Fried Chicken, had a sign in 2008 outside their establishment. You know, they have those big signs, you know, that they put the messages on. Hillary Clinton special, 2 small breasts and a left wing. You could go online and buy a Hillary nutcracker that looks, you know, look like the nutcrackers, you know, those like from the Nutcracker ballet. And it said, steel thighs, cracks the toughest nuts. Did any men get any of that? No, never. And the other thing that I think was even perhaps more bothersome and upsetting and infuriating to me is that then became also a diminution and demeaning of her ideas. So she gave a really important speech right off the bat when she was first lady that was really exploring in a very kind of personal and deep way the sort of toxicity of politics. And, you know, a very high profile reporter for the New York Times wrote a magazine piece that just completely like mansplaining, belittling her, you know, as if, who is this flaky woman who's just talking about, you know, it translates into the policies, and therefore policies like family leave, childcare, you know, earned income tax credits, human rights, women's rights, all become less important. And it's the way that they keep these things from taking precedence. And I think it's because people like Hillary were a giant threat, you know, not to be melodramatic, but essentially to the white political patriarchy.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that insight. Everything you said there, like, completely rings true, not just in the political sphere, but more broadly in life. It's almost as if you can never win, and everything that you do is going to be ridiculed, especially as a woman in such a male-dominated space.
Yep, exactly.
And the next question I have for you is a more personal one about your own career, and it's whether or not your decision, whether or not the fact that you never ended up or worked in an elected position was a conscious decision because of, for example, some of these elements of ridicule, or whether it was just a thing that wasn't particularly suited to you.
No, you know, I think there were periods when I was much younger, like really young, that I thought I wanted to go into politics. I mean, like, you know, little kid, kind of young. I think by the time I started working in politics, first of all, I think I would hate a lot of it. And the lifestyle is horrible. It's just awful. And not that wonderful people with small kids and other things don't do it. I mean, there are some amazing, especially women, and I'm sure this is true in Parliament too, but in Congress, who, you know, are single mothers of, you know, they're doing these incredible jobs. But I think I just felt like I could have a better impact, or I could, you know, my strengths were better suited to sort of behind the scenes stuff. And by then I really loved to write. So being able to write in a political sphere was, I think, what, to use the word that I used earlier, what animated me.
Thank you so much. I think we should potentially move on to some questions from everyone else now. I know that we perhaps wanted to talk about the current political situation in the US, particularly with Roe v. Wade. So if we have any questions on that, that would be wonderful as well. I know there's already some hands raised. If people want to raise hands and then unmute, or also just put a question in the chat, either way is fine.
Yeah, so if we start off with Gia.
Hiya, thank you so much for kind of speaking about your experiences. I have a couple of questions, but obviously I'll ask one first, and then everyone else, if there's time at the end, I'll ask a few more. I just wanted to kind of further tease out some of the things you were talking about earlier in terms of like masculinity and misogyny. And I kind of wanted to put them in the Oxford context. In terms of like, were there any defining experiences for you of dealing with misogyny, whether kind of like actual moments or in terms of like culturally in Oxford? So kind of looking at the way that the tutorial system is formed and the way that kind of some people believe that serves more of a masculine kind of version of education. So I don't know if that makes sense, but I just wanted to tease out some of the kind of misogyny that you faced in Oxford, if you did.
Yeah, well, I told that. Thank you very much, Gia, for that question. I mentioned the parabola incident, which, you know, I mean, honestly, I was shocked by that. But I think all of these, and you know, I went to Harvard. I was in the first class of women to live in Harvard Yard, which is the area of Harvard where freshmen live. And until then, women lived other places, and the classes were mixed, but the living and social arrangements were mixed for the first time a couple of years before that. And then I was the first class to actually integrate. So I'm very used to women entering into these institutions that literally for centuries have been dominated by men. And it's not just dominated by men. They are organized around the interests and needs of men. I mean, one of the reasons the White House had so much trouble adjusting to Hillary Clinton as an outspoken first lady with her own power center within the White House was not because they were necessarily against it, but it was like an institution that was set up to deal with this one person, the president, who had always been a white male for 200 and however many years. And it's the same. I mean, Oxford, it would be like 1,000 years, you know, so you know, I mean, sure, there are women's colleges, but even the women's colleges, they're not as wealthy. They don't have the same, why? Because women don't have the same financial networks, the same power once they leave Oxford. Not to belittle this, but I'm sure many women of earlier generations would go to Oxford and marry a guy from Oxford, and then their job was to help him, whatever. And I mean, obviously not everyone, but that was the norm in the United States. That was the norm in, you know, most of these cultures. And Oxford was really set up to perpetuate a college system that, because of money and power, was more attuned to men, to male students, to male faculty, to male interests. And I think, you know, it's not even, you don't even have to sort of parse out what that looks like. You can just deduce from that the issues of interest to women, you know, why is it so hard in the White House to get them to focus on childcare? One of the most pressing economic issues in our country for men and women. Why? Because it's a women's issue, and trade and, you know, nuclear disarmament and, you know, peace in the Middle East are all so much, you know, more macho, frankly. And I would imagine you would all know better than I do about Oxford today, but it takes a really long time to change a culture when these institutions have been set up this way for 1,000 years or 800 years or 500 years, or in Wadham's case, what, 400, 500 years. You know, it's just, it doesn't change overnight. And the only way it does change is having critical masses of women and critical masses of people who are not white males, no offense, William, who can bring a different perspective and who can, you know, who can say these other issues matter to tons of people.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Gia. Have we got any other questions amongst the audience?
I know, Gia, you mentioned that you had some more, so if that is the case, do feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, let me just check my notes. So yeah, there are two more. I'll start with this one. In Oxford, kind of speaking from a very personal perspective, I have been in rooms where, not particularly in Wadham, but in rooms where it is just a lot of posh men who are very outspoken and very confident. And I like to think of myself as a fairly confident person. However, when I'm in those situations, I don't find myself having the ability to speak up. And so I wanted to know, as someone who has sort of experienced this in the real world, not just in Oxford, how you've dealt with that, and if you have kind of advice on how to get up there and speak, because yeah, I have public spoken before, but sometimes when you're just in those situations,
Well,
you kind of freeze up.
Yeah, no, I think your experience is all too common. And it's no failing on your part. It's that it is a culture that is not inviting or welcoming or supportive necessarily to people who don't look, talk, and act a certain way. And if you're not looking, talking, and acting that way, why should they take you seriously? And you feel that, right? And so, you know, getting people who are vested with privilege and power and connections and history and all that to somehow open their arms and hearts to something different and question their own value systems, that's hard. So women experience what you're describing all the time. I know that in the White House, I mean, we would laugh about this. You go into a meeting, you're the only woman. People are bantering around with ideas. You make a comment. You have an idea. You put it out there. Nobody pays attention. 10 minutes later, some guy makes exactly the same comment. He's a genius. Everyone's like, oh my God, that's the best. That's such a great idea, Joe. I can't believe you came up with it. It's awesome. And you're like, wait, I just said that 10 minutes ago. We've all had that happen over and over and over. I mean, you probably did not watch any of the Supreme Court hearings of our new Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, or, you know, with Brett Kavanaugh having a temper tantrum a couple of years ago. The bullying and demeaning. I mean, here is a woman, a Black woman, who is one of the most accomplished jurists in America. Despite being a Black woman, she had to get there being a Black woman. So she's like 10 times better than all these guys. And the bullying, the patronizing, the nastiness of the way she was treated. And she kept her cool. I mean, if it had been me, I would have jumped over the table with my shoe and started beating them. I mean, they're just so awful. And women are just expected to suck it up and, you know, behave. And I think what you have to do is you just have to assert yourself as best you can. And I think you should, you know, try not, if to the extent that you cannot let them silence you, even if they don't listen, even if they, you know, are dismissive, still say it. You have to, if you possibly can, because nothing's ever going to happen if there's a kind of silo of one way of thinking by one group of people that is never challenged, and it's never, and, you know, maybe you find deep down in that group, there is some ally or somebody who does get it. But the worst thing is the silencing. You know, women who get out of their lane and don't agree with everything that, you know, Mr. Power or whatever are saying, you should just disappear into the woodwork and stop saying anything and be quiet and behave. Don't want you not to behave. And, you know, we can't not behave. I mean, and by the way, talking and saying your piece is not misbehaving. So I would just encourage you to, you know, to kind of steel yourself and make your points and know that it might be hurtful if they're not taken seriously, but silence is worse. Silence is the worst feeling. You know, not having a voice, giving them the power to take away your voice. That to me is one of the worst feelings.
Thank you. Am I all right to ask my final question?
Sure.
I feel as though I'm just using this as a way to get all the advice I can. And kind of the final question is, again, something that you've spoken about dealing with, and also something that in a very microcosmic way I've seen in Oxford. In the White House, I'm sure that if we just look at Donald Trump, there are loads of kind of awful people who you don't, normal people from the front don't see them as awful because we don't hear about their actions. But when you're kind of in the background, you know and you hear about it. And I just wondered like how you kept your integrity during that time, because I think sometimes it can be very easy to get whipped away into being the same bad person because everyone around you is exactly like that. So it's like the previous question, but how do you keep that integrity and be true to yourself?
Yeah, well, no, it's a great question. I mean, I would like to think that the Clinton White House had a little more integrity, that the people were motivated by public service, not by enriching themselves and not by, the sad truth about Trump and his followers is their views on everything, gay marriage, abortion, immigration, gun control, everything is the minority view in our country. And they don't have the demographics to win on the issues. So what they do is they cheat. They jigger the voting system. They make it harder for people to vote, especially Black and brown people. They gerrymander, they were very smart. They started to control the local and state governments, which control the electoral maps. So they were able to do that. And as a result, they have been able to manipulate the system such that they get elected, even though they are clearly the minority view. And what did you have on the Supreme Court? You had Mitch McConnell not allowing even a hearing for the nominee for the court of a president with more than a year before the next election. And there's never been a rule about when a Supreme Court nominee has to be. It was a made up thing to keep that seat open, hoping the Republicans would win, which they did. And so now Donald Trump has populated Supreme Court, which is so out of step with America. But what do you do about it? And I think, Gia, what you're saying is you hope you're working with people who have integrity and are in politics and government for the right business. And when they're not, I think you either have to stand up to it or you have to make a statement. I mean, so many people around Trump knew that he was corrupt, that he was dangerous, that he violated there are like stories about him flushing intelligence documents down the toilet that he didn't. I mean, the guy was, he's insane. And he was a danger and people knew it. And they were, and their rationale was, well, if we leave, then he's really there'll be no guardrails. So we have to stay because we're the guardrails, but they weren't the guardrails because this stuff kept happening. So I think you have to pick your places where you want to work. I mean, you would not want to work in the Trump White House. You might want to work in the Clinton or Obama White House. There are going to be more sort of people who you think are motivated by the same kinds of things. I think right now, especially with Roe v. Wade, the Democrats and people who are just fed up with the assault on democracy need to be active. This is just a time where you can't sit on the sidelines. We have to get people elected. We have to protest. I feel like the United States is becoming, I don't know how many of you have read The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, but I feel like we're becoming The Handmaid's Tale. This is controlling women and their rights and what they can do with their own bodies, which thus, controls their economic power. We are attacking, we are attacking one of the most popular pieces of legislation in America was gay marriage. Why? Because it crosses most ideological lines. Thankfully, that was one of the fastest campaigns that was successful in America. Now that is going to be under attack. This crap about transgender bathrooms and that's just a manufactured issue. Trying to control what you read. We're going to ban Toni Morrison because she could pollute the minds of small children. It's just one assault on and I think, the Republicans always like to say, oh, well, we don't like federal intrusion into our lives. Well, guess what? Every single thing they're doing is federal intrusion into people's rights in their lives. And so I think you just have to find the venue that is comfortable for you, that suits you, that speaks to your talents, and then go for it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your questions there, Gia. Lottie, I think you've raised your hand. Have you got a question?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. I just want to say a massive thank you for your talk. It was absolutely fascinating. Obviously, a common theme that we've had is talking about sort of gender and misogyny, and that what you spoke about in terms of how that misogyny permeates so much, including the clothes and everything. But I kind of wanted to hone in on that in terms of your role as a speechwriter. Do you ever find that your approach to writing a speech, say if you were going to write it for a man, would be different to if you were going to write it for a woman? If so, like, how does that play into it? Or if you're attempting to kind of do it in the same way, do you think that unconscious biases kind of play into that, and how can you combat those? And kind of whether you've seen with other speechwriters across your career, do you find that often male speakers will have a male speechwriter or a female speaker will have a female speechwriter, or do you find it's kind of a mix of just kind of how that balance plays out?
Such a great question, Lottie. I mean, it's a little bit hard to answer. People always say to me, well, you were a good speechwriter for Hillary Clinton because you're both women. And I do think that is partly true. I also think it's partly because, not that my mind works at near the level of hers, believe me, it does not, but we both are sort of logical, sort of lawyerly thinkers, whereas her husband, who I also wrote for, and I had a much harder time writing for him. I never felt like I could write a great speech because his mind just works in a different way. That said, I think that most good speechwriters can write for either gender. However, being attuned to gender, especially writing for women, I think can be very important. And it's one of the reasons I liked writing for her. She has had some male speechwriters who I think don't understand her experience. I'm sorry. They don't. They haven't been through what she's been through as a woman. They don't understand why that experience gives her such credibility on some of these issues. They don't understand, that there is a kind of richness to that experience that you can evoke in a speech really effectively, both to connect with your audience, but also to give credibility to the issues you're championing. And so I think for some people, it's a liability. Now, Madeleine Albright, who unfortunately just passed away, had a speechwriter for almost her entire career who was a man. All of her senior staff were women, with exception of this guy. And he's the most curmudgeonly guy you'll ever meet. Phenomenal speechwriter, and he got her. Now, he was closer in age, well, not closer in age, but closer in age to her than, let's say, some of Hillary's younger male speechwriters. But I think he was unique. I think he was a rarity. And you do have to think about it. You certainly have to think about here's a good example. Hillary, probably most famous speech was her 1995 speech to the UN Conference on Women in Beijing. And I knew I had to try really hard to make it dispassionate and not overly emotional, and at the same time personal, so that she could connect with women who were really different from her. And I worked really hard to achieve that. And one of the reasons was I didn't want her to break down in front of 1,500 delegates from around the world if she got too emotional. And I found out afterwards that that she was fighting back her emotions in parts of that speech. So I obviously didn't fully succeed. And, it's a shame to have to do that. But, women get, woman cries, oh my God, she's so weak. Oh, she's too emotional. She must be having her period, whatever. It's just the usual crap. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
You did. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you.
As well. Thanks, Lottie. Have we got any other questions from our audience? I thought you might, Will.
Thanks so much, Lissa. It's always wonderful to hear you talk about your experience. I just wanted to ask you about the 4 congresswomen, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, and Ocasio-Cortez, and how you feel their presence is it changing politics on the ground there? And if so, what are your views on it?
Well, these are the 4 women who are nicknamed the Squad, who are among the most progressive, left-leaning members of Congress, newly elected as part of the wave of women who came in a couple of years ago, I guess in 2018. and they've formed a group, and they are really, really effective at pressuring the mainstream to think about issues in different ways. And I do think that is, very helpful and good. I think where they, and it's not just them, this is true of so many members of Congress when they're new, regardless of their ideology, they forget that once you're in Congress, you're not, you can advocate for things, but your job is not advocacy. Your job is actually to make policy and get things passed so that people's lives are improved. And if you're just, and this is one of my complaints, frankly, about Bernie Sanders. He never did anything except sit on, get on the grandstand and go, oh my God, where are you? He wasn't really effective as a legislator. I will give him credit for bringing a lot of issues to the fore in the presidential campaigns, that I will say, but in Congress. And what happened with the squad is that Nancy Pelosi, and by the way, I hope there is a really big building in Washington built someday with her name emblazoned on it, because I honestly think she is the greatest Speaker of the House in the history of America. First woman and the best. And she's unbelievable. And there's a famous story, and one of the reasons she's unbelievable is she picks her battles. She has exquisite political timing. She knows when you compromise and when you don't, how far you compromise and how far you don't. And she's just masterful. And the squad came and sort of was trying to leverage their position on, I don't even remember the issue, and really kind of going after her and saying they were going to, publicly make a stink if she didn't go along with this and introduce something. And she said, here's how many votes it takes to pass this. How many votes do you have? Because at the moment, I think you have 4 and you need 221. So when you have 200 plus votes, come back to me and we'll talk about it. And her point was, you got to be practical about this. You can't just get up there and say, I'm going to demand and make noise. You only have 4 votes, your own votes. You got to cajole people. You got to get people to come along with you. You've got to do this sort of groundwork. And I think the squad, like other freshmen and new, second term members of Congress, because Pelosi is so good at this, are learning more about how you effectively play that role. I don't know, Will, does that answer your question?
Absolutely. I see them from afar over here. And so getting your input on the ground with that experience puts it into perspective.
I'll just give you one example. There's a centrist Democrat from Virginia who flipped a Republican district in 2018 named Abigail Spanberger, who she's way more to the center than I am, but I have such respect for her as a public servant and legislator. And she is so frustrated by the squad because every time they say something, it comes back to her district and haunts her. And she is a really tough district. It's going to be hard for her to get reelected. And it's like, do we want more Democrats in Congress? Because if we're a big tent, we can at least get some things done. It's really important to control Congress. But if you push too far to an extreme, or you give ammunition to the other side that's going to reduce your numbers, then you're really in deep trouble. And so there's a lot of tension in the party between the centrists and the more progressive wing. And hopefully, we can have both, because we need both. We need all those people to be elected so we don't have a Republican controlled Congress.
Very much for that insight. I think it's certainly interesting, especially to go on to think about something like this in the context of like the US two-party system, and how in other countries and other systems, perhaps you wouldn't have people such as the politician you mentioned from Virginia, and then people such as Ocasio-Cortez, who have quite different political beliefs in one party. It's quite a unique feature of the American system. We are running short on time, so I think there's Julie. Yeah, one more question from Julie.
Can I just say one thing too?
Sure.
I do think that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a singular political talent. I think she is going to be around for a long time. I think if you read about her, she is really studying how she can be effective. And she's not moderating her views. She's just being a lot smarter, again, about picking her battles, knowing when to compromise, when not. And I think she is a singular political talent. Okay, sorry.
No, thank you. Julie?
Well, I'm just sitting here listening and thinking, gosh, I wish I'd heard this 30 years ago when I was an undergraduate. because there's some really very profound truths and guidelines there. But yeah, it's incredibly kind of you to share. I wonder, Lissa, is there, what kind of advice would you give your Wadham undergraduate self if you'd known?
Oh,
Looking
my Wadham self?
Yeah.
Take my academics at Wadham much more seriously, which I did not do. I think I maybe was a little too judgmental about things that didn't comport with my view of things. I wish I had been able to do what I'm advising all of you to do, which is to, take in differences with more compassion and less judgment, or less reflexive judgment. I think there were ways in which I didn't immerse myself in Oxford that I wish I had. I spent a lot of time in London. Actually, I was a stringer for the New York Times London Bureau. So I was off writing stories for them all the time. And, did I really need to be doing that? Maybe I should have spent that time more at Oxford. But it was I have to be, if I'm going to be very honest, and I hope this won't be offensive to anybody, it was not an easy time. And I don't think it was an easy time for a lot of women at Oxford, and maybe not for men, but there was kind of a time warp for me coming from the US. And even though I had gone to Harvard, and Harvard was also in a similar transition, I think we were a little more progressive about women at that point than Oxford was. And the Rhodes community itself, which I was a part of, was also, this was the first year there were any women. And, we had to have a coming up dinner at the beginning of our first year, and I forget which term. I think probably Michaelmas term, and they have this big black tie dinner at Rhodes House, and this was the first year women were going to be attending it, and it's typical at these dinners. It's a tradition that they hand out cigars at the end, and there was a huge frenzy at Rhodes House over, if we hand out cigars, is that offensive to women, or do we expect them to want to smoke them or not? And then wouldn't you know, all of a sudden the fire marshal said, oh, we have a fire hazard at Rhodes House. We can't have cigars this year. Sorry. But they just didn't know what to do about it. It became this it became this, embarrassing thing that they were worried about. And, I think so the Rhodes community itself was in this weird transition. Oxford, Wadham at that point, I believe, had only been admitting women for, do you know Julie or William, 5?
Yeah, 3-4 years when you joined.
Not very long. And like I said at the beginning, they're not just male dominated, they're organized around the needs and concerns and care and feeding of these people. And that's the way they've been for 1,000 years. So guess what? You're suddenly coming in there and rocking the boat just by being there. You're not even trying to rock the boat. You're just rocking the boat and it created all these things. So I think for me, it was not an easy time, to be quite honest. And I've heard that from especially from other Americans and some South Africans too. There were, a number of my friends were South African, and they had similar experiences, I think.
Yeah, and I think for many women from Britain as well, I think it was a challenging time. But yeah, being brave enough to embrace diversity is certainly something I would love to learn from.
Well, it goes in all directions, and I think this is the thing. I think, and I hope, again, I don't offend anybody on the call, because what I'm going to say is going to sound, I'm sure, very generationally whatever, irrelevant. But I get very bothered when the left mirrors the right in its quickness to demean people and erase people, and self-righteously proclaims, because I think this, I am by definition right and you're wrong, so I don't need to hear from you. And it's the worst thing about Trumpism was all that stuff in the most hateful and visceral way. But we tend to do it on our side too sometimes. We're too quick to say, I just, and I mean, believe me, I believe they're wrong. I believe they are wrong. I believe they are hateful. I believe they are dangerous, but I still need to be willing to defend my views in front of that. And the way that I show the strength of my views is to be able to hear them, not to pretend they don't, not to demean them, not to diminish them. I mean, I don't know if that makes sense. And I don't want to understate how upset I am emotionally, psychologically, in every other way about what Trump has done to the United States. I mean, it is, people, my internist in Washington, my doctor, was telling me her patients were coming in during the Trump years with all these ailments they never had, insomnia and gastrointestinal issues and this and that. And she said, she said, I have a new term for it, Trumperia. And because there was like a collective psychosis with that guy. So I don't mean to diminish it. I don't really, but the way that your ideas win is by you defending them and asserting your agency and not needing to have your idea be the only idea. That's not a sign of a strength of an idea. Anyway, so I don't, it was a different time when I was there, Julie. So, what would I tell my Wadham self? I mean, yeah, I wish I had studied harder and made more of my academic time. And I wish I'd immersed myself more, but I do think it was an odd time. It may still be, I'm sure it still is in many ways, even at Wadham, which I think has, tried really, really hard to change the culture of colleges at Oxford.
Yeah. And I know no one like you, Lissa, who can sort of crystallize any sentiment, but also the Wadham ethos. So sort of the idea of embracing, asserting agency by embracing diversity and complexity, I guess, is just really important.
And contradictions. It's what I love about Wadham, is that Wadham just raised a fist and said, you know what, the Oxford way for 1,000 years has been this way. We believe we can do it differently. We believe we can be more inclusive. We believe we can represent lots of viewpoints. We believe we can be progressive. And what I just hope is that is still mindful. I mean, I have a friend who's running for governor of Maryland, and he said, I've never gotten to to addition in math by division. And his point is, and he's a wonderful guy running for Congress in Maryland, Westmore. Actually, he's a former Rhodes Scholar. He was at Oxford, and he will become, if he gets elected, the first Black governor of Maryland and one of the only Black people ever to serve as governor in the United States. But his whole point is you have to have the agency to expand. I mean, we have this, I don't mean to go on much longer, but I'll just make this one quick point. At our bookstore, we are often asked, do you carry this book? Why would you carry that book? It's offensive. If I got rid of every book in the bookstore that was offensive to me as a woman, we would have, 1/10 of the inventory. But I believe as a woman, I can stand up for my beliefs and my stature as a woman and read crap that I think is ridiculous and stupid about women. And that's important to me. So I am always going to carry books that offend me, that may offend other people, because I believe we all need to stand up to those things. And we need to know what we're dealing with. And you can't, I don't want to live in North Korea, where there's only one state sanctioned story or one point of view. And I really fear that in the US and to some degree in the UK, we're getting to this polarity where there's this view and nothing else. And nobody's talking to each other. Anyway. Sorry for the long-winded rant.
No, that's brilliant. And we've really appreciated all of the insights you've given us. And I think, yeah, you said it yourself, you hadn't planned each step of the journey, but actually it's really nice to hear that. And I think it's reassuring to know that you do learn more if you don't follow a well carved out plan necessarily. So no, I'd like to thank you on behalf of, everyone here at Wadham, the student body and the staff too. I know a lot of efforts gone into it, but we can't do it without the alumni. So it was really, really lovely to be able to interview you.
Yes, also from me, thank you so much for your advice, your insight, and just taking the time to speak to us all today. It's much appreciated.
Well, like I said, the pleasure is all mine, and I wish I were there. I really, really look forward to being there and meeting some of you in person, hopefully. And I appreciate the opportunity. I mean, it's wonderful to hear what your questions are, to know what's on your minds. You keep me on my toes. And, you know, you're all such wonderful representatives of Wadham and of what Wadham stands for. And one of the reasons I like coming back and being engaged with Wadham is because of what it stands for, especially in the sea of colleges that are not like Wadham. So thank you all, you know, for strengthening and building on the Wadham, you know, reputation for diversity and inclusion and tolerance.